Senator Hanson-Young.
Thank you, Madam Deputy President. I rise today to speak on behalf of the Australian Greens and my constituents in South Australia, who of course are outraged that once again what we see is the two big parties working together to dump on our state. Now, if you ever wanted to see an example of what happens when Labor and Liberal get together, they've got more votes on the eastern seaboard than they do in South Australia, and they dump on SA. That's what they're doing here today. South Australians are frustrated at this debate. It's gone on for so long, but they're frustrated that every time, rather than putting in the work, rather than coming up with permanent solutions, Labor and Liberal gang up together and decide, oh, well, we don't want the nuclear waste in our backyards, so we'll stick it in South Australia. We'll stick it in communities that don't want it. Now, this process has been a shamble from the beginning. The consultation process in relation to these three listed sites has been a debacle, mishandled over and over again. And of course, the different ministers in charge of it, from time to time, every time you get a new minister, you get a list of new promises, only which are to be broken, consultations rubbish, and the locals in South Australia get ignored once more. And what are we seeing today? Right now, as we're voting and debating this piece of legislation, we've seen another rolling of leadership in the National Party. But first of all, when Mr Canavan, Senator Canavan, was in charge of this portfolio, didn't care about where the waste went, as long as it wasn't in his backyard in Queensland. Oh, let's just dump on SA. Then we had Mr Pitt. What has he done? Oh, just dump on SA. And I bet your bottom dollar Mr Barnaby Joyce will do the exact same thing. Just like he wants to take all of South Australia's water, he thinks we should have all of the country's nuclear waste as well. Not our Deputy Prime Minister, I'll have you know. This bill is a disgrace. It is an affront to community consultation. It is an affront to the best available science, and it is an affront to the promise, the long-held promise that this country would get serious about a long-term permanent solution to dealing with the waste that we do have. Now, of course, we have a responsibility. We create nuclear waste. We need to store it properly. It is, of course, incredibly toxic. It's why it is difficult to do. It is also why you don't see the Prime Minister advocating that they build a nuclear waste dump in his electorate, where Lucas Heights actually is. Oh no, couldn't have it in the Prime Minister's backyard. You've got to dump it in South Australia instead. Actually, the safest place to be keeping, and the scientists tell us this over and over again, the various inquiries that have been undertaken, is to leave it where it is. And that would be, for the intermediate waste, in the Prime Minister's backyard, in the Shire, in Lucas Heights. But of course that's not what we're debating today, because the big parties and the big states think it's all very cute and easy to dump on little old South Australia. As I mentioned at the outset, Madam Deputy President, the consultation process that led up to this piece of legislation has been a debacle, an insult. If you wanted to run community consultation, this is not the way to do it. The First Nations communities in all three of these selected sites have been treated appallingly. So thankfully, one of the amendments that is going to be moved is to at least restore some type of judicial review, because the process has been so bad. The incompetence of the ministers that have been managing this for a number of years now under the National Party have treated the local South Australian First Nations communities terribly. Now, we were first told, in relation to the proposals to build a national nuclear waste dump, that this would just be for low-level waste. Oh, don't worry, we'll put this facility out in the outback where no one will really notice. It'll be low-level, doesn't matter. Let's run a process to consult. Doesn't really matter what the response is. We'll still do it. Oh, we'll pay you off too, millions of dollars. Of course, as this process has gone on, it's now been acknowledged that it's not going to just store low-level nuclear waste. This is actually going to be storing, for a temporary period of 100 years, intermediate level waste, above ground. So anyone who wants to stand in this place today and argue that it doesn't matter, this is all just about low-level waste, the type that you find in basements in hospitals, well, that is just not true. Because part of this proposal has now morphed into storing intermediate level waste. And the best available science, world practice, international standards say this should not be happening. You shouldn't be double handling this level of waste in this manner. And this is all because the government has been dragging its feet on establishing a properly independent and expert inquiry about the whole nuclear cycle in Australia that would give proper advice as to what to do with the more toxic and dangerous intermediate level waste. But of course that hasn't happened, and so now we have intermediate level waste tacked on to this proposal. Not permanently stored, it'll be above ground, and no one knows what will happen next. International experts have warned Australia that this is not okay. International bodies have said this is not best practice, and yet there is no plan from this government in what to do with it. And of course we all know what happens in these situations. You get approval for the project as it is now, you don't consult properly, you pay off the communities, hoping that they'll forget and hoping that everyone else will forget too. Well, we won't forget. South Australians are sick and tired of being dumped on like this by the Labor Party and the Liberal Party, the National Party and the big states on the eastern seaboard. Now, if you wanted to do the best practice, if you wanted to follow the science in relation to this, you'd put in place a proper plan for dealing with this intermediate waste. And yet, that is just not happening. And of course, the other issue in relation to all of this is how is this dangerous, toxic stuff going to get to South Australia in the first place? Well, it's going to be driven on our roads in big trucks, shipped from Lucas Heights in the Prime Minister's backyard all the way through around and into South Australia. And we're going to be doing that on boats. It's going to be loaded on and off in South Australia's port towns. But of course no one in Whyalla, no one in Port Augusta, no one in Port Pirie has been consulted about having this toxic stuff arrive on their front doorstep. There's been no proper community consultation. There's been no safety plan discussed as to how this toxic and dangerous waste is going to be transported to any of these three sites. This has been a disgraceful process, and still the South Australian community are left in the dark. How is this going to be transported? How often are we going to have trucks and ships full of nuclear waste coming into our state, coming into our towns? What are the people of Whyalla meant to do? Not to mention the towns and communities where this dump is built. And of course, one of the sites, Madam Deputy President, that is listed by the government in this piece of legislation, in their amendment, is in the heart of the Flinders Ranges. A jewel in the crown of our state. Now, the Flinders Ranges are spectacular. They are beautiful. It is nature at its very finest. It is loved by South Australians. It's loved by the local First Nations people. It's loved by people right around the world because of its special and unique characteristics. And today, what we're voting on is a piece of legislation that suggests this government could build a waste dump in the heart of the Flinders Ranges. And what do we see? Labor voting with the government. It's just a disgrace. Now, it doesn't go to the Flinders Ranges. The other sites close to Kimber, in some of South Australia's best, finest, prime agricultural land. And what happens with the product that's created and grown out there? It's shipped overseas, it's exported, with a superb reputation of being clean and green. But of course, senators and members of Parliament from Queensland, New South Wales and Victoria don't give two hoots about the reputation of South Australia's grain industry, our clean food and wine industry, our pristine environment. No. They just don't want to dump in their backyard. Well, South Australians don't want it either. And especially when you haven't even bothered to put in the legwork, to run a proper process, to follow best available science, to do world's best practice. You just want to tick and flick, done. Like the revolving door of the leadership of the National Party. And it's no surprise that minister after minister after minister responsible for this debacle have all been ministers of the National Party, far more interested in their own jobs, far more interested in being at the top of their party's ticket, far more interested in being Deputy Prime Minister than they are about making sure we handle this toxic and dangerous waste properly. Mr Joyce doesn't give two hoots about what happens to this waste as long as it's not in his backyard. The Prime Minister, whose electorate is right where this nuclear waste is created, doesn't want it there. Surprise, surprise. So dump it in SA and everyone will forget about it. Well, we're not going to. We're going to fight this. We want a proper process. We want independent expert advice, not special favours from national ministers. And we want our state's reputation of being a clean, green food, wine and tourism industry protected. And it's only the Greens who are standing up for this in our state in South Australia.